The skyline of 1880s Paris was a masterpiece of stone, a horizontal expanse of limestone and history that felt permanent, sacred, and untouchable. But on the morning of January 26, 1887, the ground of the Champ de Mars was broken, not for a cathedral or a palace, but for a skeleton of iron that many Parisians believed would be the death of French beauty. This was the beginning of the Eiffel Tower, a project born out of the industrial fever of the 19th century and the cold, mathematical ambition of Gustave Eiffel. To understand the darkness that surrounded this tower in the early 1900s, one must first understand the pure, unadulterated hatred that fueled its birth in the years leading up to the turn of the century. Gustave Eiffel was not an artist. He was a bridge builder, a man who spoke the language of rivets, wind pressure, and structural load. When he won the contract to build the centerpiece for the 1889 Exposition Universelle, he wasn't looking to create a romantic icon. He was looking to prove that iron could conquer the sky. But to the elite of Paris, this was an act of war. On February 14, 1887, the resistance reached a boiling point when a manifesto was published in the newspaper Le Temps. It was signed by the most famous cultural figures of the era, including Guy de Maupassant and Alexandre Dumas-Fils. They didn't just dislike the tower. They loathed it with a visceral, poetic rage. They called it a giant black smokestack, a hollow candlestick, and a truly tragic street lamp that would cast a shadow of shame over the city of light for eternity. They feared that the grace of the Louvre and the majesty of Notre Dame would be miniaturized and humiliated by this industrial pylon. Yet, while the poets screamed, the hammers began to fall. The construction was a grueling, terrifying spectacle. From 1887 to 1888, 300 workers labored in conditions that would make a modern engineer tremble. There were no safety harnesses, no hard hats, and no nets to catch a man if he slipped from a frost-covered beam 300 feet in the air. Each piece of the 18,000 individual iron parts had to be joined with a precision that had never been attempted at this scale. By the middle of 1888, the four massive legs of the tower began to rise like the reaching limbs of a metallic beast. The noise was constant, a rhythmic, deafening clanging of 2.5 million rivets being hammered into place by teams of 4 men. One man would heat the rivet until it glowed a demonic cherry red. Another would hold it. A third would shape the head, and the fourth would beat it with a sledgehammer until the iron fused with iron. This sound echoed through the streets of Paris, a constant reminder to the citizens that the monster was growing. On September 18, 1888, the darkness turned inward as the workers went on strike. They were climbing higher than any human had ever worked, and as the autumn winds began to howl for the lattice work, the fear of death became a daily companion. They demanded higher wages for the suicide shifts at the summit. Eiffel, a man of iron himself, negotiated with the coldness of a ledger book, eventually granting a small raise but refusing to slow the pace. The deadline of the 1889 World's Fair was a ticking clock that mattered more than the nerves of the men. As the tower reached its full height in early 1889, a strange hysteria gripped the neighborhood. Residents filed lawsuits, convinced that the tower's weight would cause the very crust of the earth to collapse, or that it would act as a massive lightning rod that would incinerate the surrounding homes during a summer storm. They saw it as a lightning-attracting gallows. When Gustave Eiffel finally climbed the 1,700 steps to the top on March 31st, 1889, to unfurl the French tricolor, he thought the battle was won. He stood at 300 meters, looking down on a city that still largely wished his creation would fall. The tower was inaugurated amidst fireworks and a 21-gun salute, but the contract signed on January 8, 1887, remained a dark omen. The tower was only permitted to stand for 20 years. It was a temporary guest, a metal freak show destined for the scrap heap in 1909. This sense of transience gave the tower a haunting atmosphere in the early 1900s. It was a monument waiting to die. The Iron Lady was viewed as a rusting, useless weight that served no purpose other than to remind the French of their industrial arrogance. But as the 1900s progressed, the tower began to find a new, darker utility. It became a magnet for the desperate and the daring. The height that Eiffel had conquered became a temptation for those who wanted to leave the world behind. The first recorded shadow of tragedy began to loom as the public realized that this was not just a viewpoint, but a precipice. The early 1900s saw the tower transition from a hated object of art to a cold laboratory for science. Eiffel, desperate to save his creation from the 1909 demolition date, allowed scientists to use the summit for experiments that bordered on the occult and the extreme. They measured air pressure, studied the effect of extreme altitude on the human heart, and eventually used the iron frame to capture the invisible radio waves. This shift from monument to machine only added to its eerie reputation. To the superstitious, the tower was now listening to the world, pulling voices out of the air. By 1905, the tower was a lonely giant, often shrouded in the thick coal smoke fog of Paris, its iron skin turning a deep weather brown. The critics had not gone away. They were simply waiting for clock to strike midnight on the 20-year lease. Little did they know that the coming decade would bring a series of events, a tragic jump, a world-altering war, and a con artist's daring plot that would cement the Eiffel Tower's legacy not as a monument of beauty, but as a silent witness to the darkest impulses of the 20th century. The hate of 1887 had evolved into a cold, unsettling fascination, setting the stage for the horrors and wonders that would define the tower's life in the decades to follow. The winds of 1905 and 1906 screamed to the iron lattice with a haunting, metallic whistle that seemed to moan for the tower's own impending demise, as the 20-year expiration date loomed closer with every tick of the Parisian clocks. This was the era where the tower sat in a strange, liminal space, caught between being a failed experiment of the past and a weapon of the future. While the general public had grown somewhat used to its presence, the darker elements of its history were beginning to take root in the soil of the Champ de Mars. Gustave Eiffel, a man whose pride was as rigid as the puddle iron he used to build his masterpiece, knew that the only way to save the tower from being dismantled in 1909 was to make it indispensable to the French military, turning it from an aesthetic eyesore into a vital organ of national security. On a cold morning in 1903, Eiffel approached the French military with a proposition that would change the course of history, suggesting that the tower's height made it the perfect mast for wireless telegraphy. By January 21st, 1904, the first permanent radio station was installed at the summit, and suddenly, the tower was no longer just a view, it was an ear. It was during these years that the tower began to breathe in a way that terrified the locals, as massive sparks of electricity would jump from the transmitters, crackling like lightning trapped in a cage. This period was marked by an unsettling atmosphere where the tower was increasingly associated with the invisible and the supernatural. In 1905, the tower's laboratory became the site of grueling physical experiments. Scientists like Theodore Wolff began measuring ionizing radiation at the top, discovering that levels were higher at the summit than on the ground, inadvertently stumbling upon cosmic rays while standing on a platform that many still believed was cursed. The physical toll on the men who worked these radio stations was immense. They lived in cramped, vibrating wooden shacks at the top, buffeted by gales that made the entire structure sway up to 9 centimeters. The isolation at 300 feet created a psychological darkness, a sense of being detached from humanity that crawled like ants on the streets of Paris below. As 1907 arrived, the countdown to the tower's destruction became a national debate. The artist protests of the previous decade had not been forgotten, and many still argued that once the clock struck midnight on December 31st, 1909, the Iron Monster should be sold for scrap. But on a pivotal day in 1908, the military successfully transmitted a radio signal from the tower to North America, proving its strategic worth. This victory for Eiffel was a dark turning point. It meant the tower survived, but it survived as a machine of war. The atmosphere of the tower during these final years of the decade was thick with the scent of ozone and the cold, damp fog of the Seine. In 1909, just months before the lease was set to expire, the French government officially renewed the concession, but the tower that remained was not the triumphant symbol of the World's Fair. It was a weathered, rusting giant that had become a sight for the desperate. It was during this time that the first whispers of the Tower of Suicides began to circulate in the dark corners of Parisian cafes. The very heights that Eiffel had climbed to show human progress were now being looked at as a final exit for the brokenhearted and the bankrupt. The year 1910 brought a new kind of darkness when the Great Flood of Paris submerged the base of the tower. For weeks, the Iron Lady stood knee-deep in the filthy, rising waters of the Seine, looking like a discarded toy in a flooded playground. The basement engine rooms, which powered the massive hydraulic elevators, were drowned in silt and cold water, rendering the tower a silent, unmoving ghost. It was during this flood that the tower felt most vulnerable, a symbol of human arrogance being reclaimed by the elements. But the most chilling moment of this early era came as the calendar turned toward 1912. The tower had survived its birth. It had survived the hatred of the poets, and it had survived the flood, but it could not survive the madness of Franz Reichelt. Reichelt, an Austrian tailor, had become obsessed with the idea of a parachute suit that would allow a man to drift safely from great heights. On the morning of February 4th, 1912, he arrived at the tower, telling the guards he intended to use a dummy for his test. Instead, he stepped onto the ledge of the first platform himself. The crowd below watched in a horrific, stunned silence as Reichelt hesitated for nearly 40 seconds, his eyes fixed on the cold ground 57 meters below. The shadow of the tower seemed to lengthen as he finally jumped. The parachute did not open. It folded around him like a shroud. He hit the frozen soil with such force that he left a crater 20 centimeters deep. This was the first death captured on film at the tower, a haunting piece of footage that transformed the monument in the public imagination from a feat of engineering into a site of tragic, public sacrifice. The blood of the flying tailor on the Champ de Mars marked the end of the tower's innocence. From that day forward, the Eiffel Tower was no longer just a structure of iron. It was a monument that demanded a price in human life. As the world moved closer to the catastrophic explosion of World War I, the tower stood ready, its radio ears straining to catch the first whispers of the coming slaughter, its iron frame vibrating with the tension of a century that was about to lose its mind. The transition from the tragic sacrifice of Franz Reichelt into mid-1920s marked a shift from the physical darkness of death to the psychological darkness of greed, as the Eiffel Tower became the stage of the most audacious swindle in the history of the modern world. By 1925, the Iron Lady was at her lowest point. She was covered in layers of soot, her paint was peeling in massive rusted flakes, and the French government was publicly complaining about the astronomical cost of her upkeep. This vulnerability was a beacon for a man named Victor Lustig, a master con artist with a dozen aliases, and a charm that could melt the very iron he intended to sell. On a humid afternoon in May 1925, Lustig sat in a Parisian cafe and read a small, almost insignificant newspaper article discussing the tower's state of decay. The article joked that perhaps the most merciful thing to do would be to tear it down. To Lustig, this wasn't a joke. It was a blueprint for a masterpiece of deception. He immediately commissioned high-quality forged stationery embossed with the seal of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs and invited 6 of the city's most prominent scrap metal dealers to a highly confidential meeting at the Hotel de Crillon, one of Paris's most expensive and prestigious locations. On the morning of May 12, 1925, the dealers arrived, convinced they were part of a state secret. Lustig played his role with a cold, calculated perfection, leaning over the table and whispering that the government, burdened by the post-war economy, had decided to sell the Eiffel Tower for scrap. He took them on a tour of the monument in a rented limousine, pointing out the rusted rivets and the swaying beams, whispering that the tower was a public danger waiting to collapse. Among the dealers was a man named André Poussin, a newcomer to the Parisian business scene, who was desperate for a deal that would make his reputation. Lustig sensed Poussin's insecurity and pounced. He didn't just ask the price of the scrap. He complained about his low government salary, subtly hinting that a bribe would ensure Poussin won the bid. This was a stroke of genius. By asking for a bribe, Lustig convinced Poussin that he was a genuine, corrupt government official. On a dark, rain-slicked evening in late May 1925, Poussin handed Lustig a suitcase filled with enough cash to buy the entire tower several times over. Lustig took the money, boarded a train for Vienna, and waited for the headlines to scream his name. But the headlines never came. Poussin was so utterly humiliated by his own stupidity that he never reported the crime to the police, allowing Lustig the unbelievable opportunity to return to Paris 6 months later to try and sell the tower a second time. This era of the 1920s added a layer of sleaze and criminality to the tower's shadow, proving that the monument was now a symbol of how easily the world could be fooled. As the decade groaned toward its end, the tower's secret life became even more bizarre. High above the streets, in a small, cramped apartment built into the very top of the tower, Gustave Eiffel's ghost seemed to linger. Though Eiffel had died on December 27, 1923, His private office remained a place of eerie silence amidst the wind, containing a wax figure of Thomas Edison and scientific instruments that sat gathering dust while the world below spiraled into the Great Depression. By 1929, the tower was no longer the tallest structure in the world, having been surpassed by the Chrysler Building in New York, and it stood like a forgotten king, stripped of its crown and its dignity. The iron began to sing a different tune as the 1930s approached, a tune of geopolitical tension. The radio towers at the summit were no longer just sending weather reports. They were now pulsing with the coded messages of a Europe that was rearming for a second, even darker conflict. The 1930s saw the tower draped in massive neon signs for the Citroën car company, turning the monstrous smokestack into a glowing 300-meter-tall advertisement, a capitalist desecration that many Parisians felt was a final insult to the city's skyline. But even this neon glow could not hide the gathering storm. By 1934 and 1935, the atmosphere around the Champ de Mars was electric with anxiety. The tower's elevators, which had once carried royalty and inventors, were now being inspected by military engineers who knew that if Paris fell, the tower would be the ultimate prize. The darkness of the 1900s was no longer about a single man jumping to his death or a con artist selling the beams. It was now about the shadow of a swastika that was beginning to stretch across the border from Germany. The tower stood as a silent, metallic sentinel, waiting for the day the elevators would stop and the stairs would become a battlefield, marking the beginning of the most harrowing chapter in its long, iron life. The 1930s drew to a close with a sense of suffocating dread that seemed to vibrate through every river of the Eiffel Tower, as the world watched the map of Europe bleed into the colors of the Third Reich. By the spring of 1940, the Iron Lady was no longer a symbol of French ingenuity or a playground for con artists. She had become a strategic fortress, a silent witness to the approaching thunder of the Wehrmacht. On June 10, 1940, the French government fled Paris, leaving the city an open wound, and the atmosphere around the Champ de Mars turned into one of cold, industrial mourning. As the German columns drew closer, a group of French resistance workers and tower technicians made a desperate, silent vow. They knew that Adolf Hitler, a man obsessed with the architecture of power, would want to stand at the summit of the tower to look down upon his conquest. On the night of June 13, 1940, just hours before the Nazi boot struck the pavement of the Place de la Concorde, the French workers descended into dark, oil-slick machinery rooms in the tower's base. With heavy hearts and steady hands, they sabotaged the massive hydraulic elevator cables. They ensured that if the Fuhrer wanted a view from the top, he would have to earn it with his own breath and blood. When the German 30th Infantry Division marched into Paris on June 14, 1840, the first thing they did was rush to the tower to hoist a massive swastika flag. The first flag they flew was so large it was caught by the wind and blown away within hours, replaced by a smaller one. But the message was clear. Paris was under the shadow of the Hook Cross. A few days later, on June 23, 1940, Adolf Hitler arrived for his infamous lightning tour of the city. He stood at the base of the tower, his eyes tracing the iron beams upward toward the sky he now claimed to own. But when he moved toward the elevators, the German officers were forced to deliver a humiliating report. The French saboteur had rendered the lifts useless, and repair parts were impossible to find under the occupation. Hitler looked at the 1,665 steps that spiraled into clouds and declined to climb. It was famously said by the Parisians in the whispered shadows of the night that Hitler conquered France, but he never conquered the Eiffel Tower. The image of Hitler standing in front of the tower at the Trocadero remains one of the darkest photographs of the 20th century, a haunting collision of 19th century liberalism and 20th century fascism. Throughout the occupation, from 1940 to 1944, the tower became a ghost. The public was banned from its decks. The Germans used the summit to install a powerful television transmitter for Fernsehsender Paris, broadcasting Nazi propaganda to the few television sets available in the city, turning Eiffel's scientific dream into a mouthpiece for hatred. The iron was painted a dull military gray, and the searchlights at the top, which once guided pilots, now scanned the skies for Allied bombers. The most terrifying moment in the tower's history, however, came in August 1944. As the Allied forces broke through the lines at Normandy and raced toward the capital, Hitler issued a scorched-earth order to General Dietrich von Choltitz, the military governor of Paris. On August 23, 1944, the order was explicit. Paris must not fall into the hands of the enemy except as a field of ruins. The Eiffel Tower was top of the list for destruction. German engineers began calculating the amount of explosives needed to topple the 7,000-ton structure into the Seine, envisioning a twisted wreck of iron blocking the river and crushing the bridges. For 3 days, the fate of the tower hung by a thread, a single command away from becoming a memory. But Choltitz, in a rare act of defiance, or perhaps a late-found clarity of the tower's eternal value, stalled. On August 25, 1944, as the French 2nd Armored Division entered the city, a brave firefighter named Henri Arnold scaled the tower under sniper fire. He carried with him a makeshift tricolor made of 3 sheets sewn together. At the summit, he tore down the Nazi flag and raised the blue, white, and red of France. The elevator suddenly and miraculously began to work again just hours after the Germans retreated, a final insult to the occupiers who had been forced to take the stairs for 4 long years. The liberation of the tower marked the end of its darkest military chapter, but the scars of the 1940s remained etched in the iron. The tower emerged from the war not just as a monument, but as a survivor, a veteran of the century's greatest darkness, ready to face the Cold War era where its radio ears would once again become the most important listening post in Western Europe. As the dust of World War II settled, the 1950s arrived, bringing with them a new, cold, and calculated atmosphere that seeped into the iron joints of the Eiffel Tower. The liberation of 1944 had saved the structure from demolition, but the post-war era transformed it into a silent warrior of the airwaves. By 1952, the tower was no longer just a symbol of French pride. It had become the primary television transmitter for the newly formed RTF, the French national broadcaster. On a crisp morning in 1953, the summit was altered forever as a massive new telecommunications antenna was bolted to the top, bringing the tower's total height to 324 meters. This was the era of the electronic shadow. The tower was now pulsating with invisible energy, broadcasting the first televised images to a nation hungry for distraction from the scars of war. However, this technological advancement brought a recurring danger: fire. On January 3, 1956, a devastating fire broke out in the television transmitter cabin at the very summit. The city watched in horror as thick, oily black smoke billowed from an Iron Lady's head. For hours, firefighters struggled to reach the blaze, their ladders useless at such extreme heights, forcing them to carry heavy equipment up the narrow, freezing stairs in a desperate race to prevent the heat from warping the structural iron. The fire destroyed the top of the tower and knocked out television signals across France for months, serving as a dark reminder that the monument was as fragile as it was massive. As the 1950s groaned into the 1960s, the tower became a focal point for the Cold War's psychological tension. Beneath its feet, in the secret bunkers carved into the Champ de Mars, military officials monitored radio frequencies from across the Iron Curtain. The tower was listening again, its iron frame acting as a giant lightning rod for the world's secrets. This period also saw a resurgence of the tower's darker reputation as a site of finality. Despite increased security, the Tower of Suicides moniker persisted in the Parisian underground. By the mid-1960s, the number of people who had chosen to jump from its heights since its birth in 1889 had reached a staggering and somber figure, leading the government to install the first heavy, curved steel cages and safety nets that we see today. These bars transformed the experience of the tower from one of open, airy freedom into one of enclosure and caution, a physical manifestation of the world's growing anxiety during the nuclear age. In 1964, the French Minister of Culture, André Malraux, officially designated the tower as a historical monument, finally ending the 80-year-old debate about its right to exist. But even this legal protection couldn't stop the wear of time. By the late 1960s, engineers discovered that the iron was tired. The millions of visitors, the heavy antennas, and the decades of soot had taken a toll. A secret report suggested that the tower was beginning to lean slightly more than normal due to uneven thermal expansion, leading to a massive, multi-year renovation project that saw the removal of thousands of tons of unnecessary weight. The tower was literally gutted to save its life, Its original spiral staircase is removed and its restaurants rebuilt from scratch. As the decade closed, the Eiffel Tower stood as a bizarre paradox. It was a 19th century skeleton living in a 20th century world of satellites and jet engines. It had survived the hatred of artists, the greed of con artists, the explosives of the Nazis, and the fires of technology. But as it entered the final decades of 1900s, it remained a dark, iron sentinel, watching a world that was changing much faster than its own rusted rivets could ever allow. Gemini said, "The 1970s dawned with a cold, metallic indifference as the Eiffel Tower found itself caught in the middle of a rapidly modernizing Paris that was beginning to view the 19th century icon as a cumbersome relic. While the world looked toward the moon and the digital horizon, the Iron Lady was suffering from a hidden internal rot. By 1972, the structural integrity of the tower had become a matter of national anxiety. The original iron was struggling under the weight of nearly a century of modifications, heavy broadcasting equipment, and the millions of human feet that trampled its decks. On a gray afternoon in 1974, engineers made a startling discovery during a routine inspection. The massive hydraulic pistons in the east and west pillars, which had functioned since March 1889, were beginning to fail. The tower was quite literally sinking into its own history. This triggered a period of surgical darkness throughout the mid-1970s, where the tower was partially closed to the public, draped in scaffolding that looked more like a funeral shroud than a construction site. It was during these quiet, shadowed years that the rumors of the underground city beneath the tower began to resurface in the Parisian tabloids. Deep below the South Pillar, the secret military bunkers, originally constructed in 1909 and expanded during the World Wars, were rumored to have been converted into a command center for French nuclear deterrent. The tower was no longer just a tourist attraction. It was a 300-meter-tall lightning rod for the Cold War's deepest secrets, a silent antenna capable of communicating with submarines hidden beneath the polar ice caps. As the calendar turned toward the 1980s, the tower underwent a transformation that was as much about survival as it was about vanity. On a pivotal day in 1980, the city government realized that the tower's weight had to be reduced or it would eventually buckle under its own gravity. Between 1981 and 1985, a massive, invisible operation took place. Nearly 1,300 tons of iron and concrete were stripped away from the upper decks, equivalent to the weight of several hundred elephants, and replaced with lighter, high-tech steel composites. The original spiral staircases, the very ones Hitler had been too exhausted to climb in 1940, were dismantled and sold at auction, scattered across the globe like the bones of a fallen saint. One section of the staircase was bought by a private collector in 1983 for a staggering sum, proving that while the tower was dying in pieces, its legend was more profitable than ever. The year 1986 brought a new kind of light that only served to emphasize the dark hollows of the iron frame. On New Year's Eve, the tower debuted its golden lighting system, thousands of sodium lamps that made the structure glow like a furnace. This was a turning point in the tower's public image. The Iron Monster of 1887 was being rebranded as the icon of romance. But even this glow could not hide the tragedy of March 31st, 1989, the tower's 100th anniversary. As the city celebrated a century of the Eiffel Tower, the atmosphere was marred by the realization that the monument had become a golden cage. The security measures, the glass barriers, and the constant police presence required to protect it from the rising threat of global terrorism turned the once open park of the Champ de Mars into a fortified zone. The century ended with the tower standing as a shimmering, electric ghost, a monument that had witnessed the birth of the car, the plane, the atomic bomb, and the internet. It had survived the 1900s by shedding its skin and selling its soul to the gods of tourism and technology, remaining a silent, dark sentinel that had outlasted every critic who ever wished for its demolition. As the clock struck midnight on December 31st, 1999, and Millennium fireworks exploded from its beams, the Eiffel Tower stood not as a masterpiece of art, but as the ultimate survivor of the bloodiest and most transformative century in human history. As the world crossed the threshold into the final decade of the 20th century, the Eiffel Tower stood as a paradoxical relic, a 19th century skeleton wrapped in the neon and fiber optics of a digital age. The year 1990 marked a period of profound reflection for the Iron Lady, as historians and engineers look back at a century of survival that seemed to defy the laws of both physics and politics. The darkness of the 1990s was not found in the threat of demolition or the boots of invaders, but in the crushing weight of its own fame. By 1991, the tower had become the most visited paid monument on the planet, but this popularity brought a new, quiet erosion. The sheer volume of human breath and perspiration within the enclosed galleries was creating a microclimate that accelerated the oxidation of the internal iron. On a humid night in 1992, a specialized team of climber painters began the monumental task of hand-applying 60 tons of Eiffel Tower brown paint, a custom-mixed shade designed to fade into the sky. These men, working in the dead of night to avoid the tourist crowds, moved like spiders across the lattice, their headlamps the only flickers of light in a city that never slept. They were the silent guardians of the dying craft, using techniques that have remained unchanged since 1887 to protect a structure that was increasingly being managed by computers. In 1993, the tower's role as a silent listener reached a new peak of intensity. The secret bunkers beneath the North Pillar, which had served the military for decades, were now part of a sophisticated global surveillance network. As the Yugoslav wars raged to the east, the tower summit was bristling with clandestine sensors and encrypted relay stations, capturing the electronic whispers of a continent in turmoil. The tower was no longer just a French icon. It was a vertical battlefield of information. The year 1995 brought a localized terror that Paris had not felt since the war, as a series of bombings by the GIA struck the city's metro system. The Eiffel Tower was immediately placed under a high-alert vigiparate status. The open, democratic space that Gustave Eiffel had envisioned was carved up by security cordons and metal detectors. The Iron Lady was being placed behind glass, a victim of the very globalization she had helped to broadcast. As 1997 approached, the tower witnessed a tragedy that shook the world perception of Paris as a city of love. Following the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, in the nearby Pont El Alma tunnel, the tower stood in a somber, unlit state for the first time in years, its dark silhouette a towering headstone for the era's most famous icon. This event marked a shift in the tower's energy. It was now the global focal point for collective mourning and celebration. By 1998, as France prepared to host the World Cup, the tower was draped in a massive electronic countdown clock, its iron frame becoming a giant ticker tape for the passing of time. The century was ending, and the tower was racing toward the new millennium with a frantic, electric energy. On the final night of the century, December 31st, 1999, the Eiffel Tower was the center of the world's gaze. A special sparkle lighting system, consisting of 20,000 high-pressure flashbulbs, was installed by daring technicians who braved the winter gales of December. As the clock struck midnight, the tower did not just glow. It exploded in a rhythmic, blinding strobe that could be seen from the outskirts of the city. To the millions watching, it was a triumph of technology and joy. But to those who knew its history, the light was a mask for a century of blood, iron, and shadows. The tower had entered the 1900s as a hated, temporary experiment and exited as an eternal, indestructible god. It had survived the suicide of Reichelt, the greed of Lustig, the hatred of Hitler, and the fires of 1956. As the first sun of the year 2000 rose over the Seine, the Eiffel Tower stood cold and silent once more, a monument that had outlived its creators, its critics, and the very century that tried so hard to destroy it. The transition into the first light of the 21st century did not erase the ghosts of the 1900s. Instead, it solidified the Eiffel Tower as a living museum of human struggle. As the Millennium celebrations faded, the year 2000 brought a haunting realization to the engineers of the Société d'Exploitation de la Tour Eiffel. The monument was no longer just a structure of iron, but a massive, vertical data center. In early 2001, the tower's secret military role became even more profound as global tensions shifted. The summit, which had once merely broadcast radio plays and early television, was now packed with high-frequency interceptors and encrypted communication arrays. Beneath the feet of the millions of tourists, the underground bunkers, some of which were still classified as military zones, vibrated with a hum of servers and cooling systems. The tower was effectively the central nervous system of France, a 300-meter-tall sensor that captured the whispers of a world moving into an era of digital warfare. On September 11th, 2001, the darkness of the new century struck with a global shockwave. The Eiffel Tower, as the ultimate symbol of Western culture, was immediately identified as a primary target. For the first time since the dark days of 1940, the tower was evacuated not because of fire or mechanical failure, but because of the threat of total destruction from the sky. The atmosphere changed instantly. The Iron Lady was no longer an open symbol of romance, but a fortified citadel. Armed soldiers with automatic rifles became a permanent fixture at its base, patrolling the shadows of the four pillars. This security shift changed the very psychology of the site. The once free movement around the Champ de Mars was restricted by heavy barriers and a constant, watchful eye. In 2002 and 2003, as the world debated the invasion of Iraq, the tower became a canvas for political protest. Massive anti-war demonstrations flooded the gardens below, the protesters looking up at the iron beams that had survived the Nazi occupation. The tower stood indifferent, its iron skin having seen enough of human conflict to know that empires rise and fall, but the rivets remain. By 2004, a new environmental darkness began to take hold. Scientists realized that the extreme weather patterns of the 21st century, the devastating heat waves of 2003 that killed thousands in Paris, were causing the tower to expand and contract in ways that were never predicted in the 1880s. The tower was moving more than ever, its summit swaying and its iron groaning under the thermal stress of a warming planet. The year 2005 marked another technological milestone that brought its own set of risks. The tower's lighting system was once again overhauled, but the intensity of the light began to attract millions of migratory birds who, blinded by the golden glow, would often collide with the cold iron in the dead of night. This ecological shadow added a tragic, natural layer to the tower's history, a reminder that human monuments often demand a toll from the natural world. As the 2000s progressed toward 2008 and 2009, the tower prepared for its 120th anniversary. But the celebration was saner and more calculated than the 100th. The tower was now a brand, a global icon that was managed with the precision of a Swiss watch. The original Monument of Hate had become the most profitable and protected piece of real estate in Europe. As the first decade of the 2000s closed, the Eiffel Tower remained a silent witness to a world that was becoming increasingly digital, fragmented, and volatile. It had survived the transition from the steam engine to the smartphone, from the telegraph to the internet, and from the era of kings to the era of global terror. It stood as a reminder that iron, when forged with enough ambition and defended with enough blood, can outlast the very civilization that built it. The darkest story of the tower was not just about the deaths, the scams, or the wars, but about the chilling endurance of the object itself, a hollow, iron ghost that watched everything, felt everything, and yet remained cold, silent, and immortal. The year 2010 arrived with a cold, digital precision that threatened to strip the Eiffel Tower of its mystery, turning the Iron Lady into a data point in a world obsessed with connectivity. Yet, even in this modern era, the tower maintained a hidden, darker life that the millions of tourists snapping selfies below could never truly perceive. By 2011, the tower's role as a beacon of the airwaves faced a new challenge as the world shifted entirely to digital broadcasting. The summit was again invaded by engineers, bolting on more sophisticated equipment that pulsed with invisible frequencies, turning the monument into a giant, vertical hub for a world that was becoming increasingly untethered from reality. On a freezing night in 2012, exactly 100 years after the tragic death jump of Franz Reichelt, the tower stood in a thick, haunting fog that seemed to swallow its upper decks. This centenary was a somber reminder of the suicide shadow that had never truly left the structure. Despite the cages and the nets, the tower remained a target for the desperate, a metallic cliff in the heart of a stone city. In 2013 and 2014, the darkness took on a more physical and structural form. The tower's first floor underwent a massive renovation, where the solid floors were replaced with thick, transparent glass. This glass void created a new kind of terror for visitors, a vertigo-inducing view of the 57-meter drop that reminded the public of the tower's inherent danger. While it was marketed as a thrill, many saw it as a metaphor for the modern age, a fragile, transparent existence suspended over a terrifying fall. During the same period, the subterranean secret rooms became the focus of intense speculation as the world learned about the depth of global surveillance. The tower's antennas were no longer just for French television. They were part of a silent, pan-European network that monitored the pulse of the continent, a vertical spy in a city of secrets. The year 2015 brought a darkness that Paris will never forget. Following the horrific terror attacks at the Charlie Hebdo offices and the Bataclan Theater, the Eiffel Tower became a symbol of a city under siege. For several nights, the Iron Lady went dark, her lights extinguished in a sign of mourning that was more powerful than any illumination. When the lights were finally turned back on, the tower was bathed in the red, white, and blue of the tricolor, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer a park. It was a fortress. By 2017, the French government decided to build a permanent, bulletproof glass wall around the base of the tower. The iron monster that the artists of 1887 had wanted to tear down was now being encased in a transparent cage for her own protection. This wall, completed in 2018, symbolized the final end of the tower's accessibility. To touch the iron, one now had to pass through multiple layers of security, a haunting reflection of a world that had traded freedom for safety. In 2019, as the tower celebrated its 130th anniversary, a catastrophic fire broke out at the nearby Notre Dame Cathedral. As the spire of the ancient church collapsed into flames, the people of Paris turned their tear-filled eyes toward the Eiffel Tower. For a terrifying few hours, there was a collective fear that the city's other great icon might be next. The tower stood silent that night, her iron frame illuminated by the distant orange glow of the burning cathedral, a reminder that even the most immortal-looking structures are only one spark away from oblivion. As 2020 approached, the final year of the decade brought a silence that the tower had not known since the World Wars. The global pandemic of COVID-19 forced the Iron Lady to close her doors for the longest period in her history. The Champ de Mars was empty, the elevator sat still, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the cold, rusted rivets. The tower stood like a skeletal ghost in a deserted city, a monument to a civilization that had suddenly vanished. This silence was the ultimate darkness, a realization that without the people to admire or hate it, the Eiffel Tower was nothing more than 7,000 tons of lonely, weathered iron. As the sun set on the final day of 2020, the tower stood ready for whatever the next century would bring, having proven that she could survive not just the hatred of men, but the very disappearance of humanity itself. The year 2021 emerged from the global silence of the pandemic, but the Eiffel Tower that reappeared to the world was a monument burdened by the physical decay of over 130 years. While the tourists returned with their cameras and their laughter, the engineers were whispering about a hidden crisis. A series of confidential reports leaked to the French media suggested that the Iron Lady was in a state of terminal neglect. Despite the golden glow of her nighttime lights, the iron beneath was suffering from deep, systemic corrosion. The paint, which acts as the tower's only skin and protection against the acidic rain of Paris, was peeling away to reveal rusted scars that had been ignored for decades. This period marked the beginning of the Great Preservation War. Gustave Eiffel had famously stated that the only way to save the tower was to paint it every 7 years. But by the mid-2020s, the monument was being treated with a cosmetic approach rather than a structural one. The darkness of this era was a realization that the world's most famous icon was, in many ways, a hollow shell held together by the prayers of engineers and the sheer stubbornness of 19th century metallurgy. In 2022 and 2023, the tower became the center of a new kind of geopolitical theater. As Europe faced its most significant energy crisis in generations, the lights of the Eiffel Tower, usually a beacon of opulence, were dimmed earlier and earlier each night to conserve power. Seeing the Iron Lady go dark at 11:45 p.m. felt like watching a giant fall asleep prematurely, a haunting visual representation of a continent in retreat. Yet, even in this dim state, the tower's summit remained as active as ever. The secret military hardware, now more advanced than ever, was tracking the movement of satellites and signals across a fractured world. The tower had evolved into a vertical fortress of intelligence, its role in the electronic defense of France becoming so critical that the airspace above was declared a permanent no-fly zone, guarded by rapid response units. The year 2024 brought the eyes of the world back to the Champ de Mars for the Paris Olympic Games. The tower was draped in the Olympic rings, its iron frame acting as the backdrop for a global celebration of human strength. But behind the scenes, the security was at its most suffocating level in history. Underwater drones patrolled the Seine at the tower's feet, and AI-driven surveillance cameras mapped the face of every individual who entered the glass cage at its base. The tower had become the ultimate symbol of the 21st century paradox, a monument to the revolution and liberty of 1889 that was now the most surveilled and controlled space in Europe. The open park where the children of Paris once played freely was now a maze of ballistic glass and facial recognition scanners. As we move through 2025 and into the present day of 2026, the Eiffel Tower stands as a survivor of 3 different centuries, each darker and more complex than the last. It has transitioned from a hated pylon to a war machine, from a con artist prize to a digital spy, and from a romantic icon to a fortified survivor. The iron that was forged in the fires of the 1880s has now been touched by the hands of millions, scarred by the boots of occupiers, and shaken by the vibrations of a digital world. The darkest story of the Eiffel Tower is ultimately a story of endurance. It is the story of a structure that was never meant to last more than 20 years, but refused to die, watching as the world around it burned, rebuilt, and changed. As the sun sets over the Paris skyline today, the shadow of the tower stretches long and thin across the city, a cold, iron ghost that serves as a reminder that humanity's greatest achievements are often built on a foundation of controversy, blood, and an unbreakable will to stand tall against the wind. The Iron Lady remains, silent and watchful, waiting for the next century to begin its own dark chapter beneath her feet. The year 2026 finds the Eiffel Tower in a state of suspended animation, a metallic titan existing in a world that has almost entirely migrated into the digital ether. As the Iron Lady approaches her 140th anniversary, the darkness surrounding her is no longer found in the threat of a con artist's hammer or a dictator's explosives, but in the slow, agonizing reality of material fatigue. The iron, pulled from the earth in the 1880s, is now battling the chemical atmosphere of a post-industrial world. Every morning, before the first tourist sets foot on an elevator, a silent army of inspectors crawls through the interior of the pillars, using ultrasonic scanners to listen to the heartbeat of the metal. They are looking for the microscopic cracks that signal the end of a structural era. The tower has become a patient on permanent life support, held together by the most advanced resins and reinforcements modern science can provide, a stark contrast to the simple rivets and sledgehammers that birthed her. In this current year of 2026, the tower's role as a vertical fortress has reached its zenith. The summit is now bristling with quantum-encrypted communication arrays, making it the most significant node in the European security network. While the world below focuses on a romantic glow of the golden lights, the tower is secretly engaging in a silent war of frequencies, intercepting the invisible data streams of a continent in flux. The secret apartment of Gustav Eiffel at the very top, once a place for quiet scientific reflection with Thomas Edison, is now surrounded by high-tech sensors that monitor the air for everything from chemical agents to radiation. The tower is the ultimate sentinel, a 300-meter-tall guardian that never sleeps, never blinks, and never forgets the blood that was spilled to keep her standing. The psychology of the tower has also shifted in the eyes of the Parisian public. To a new generation, the iron monster of 1887 is no longer a monster or even a monument. She is a survivor of the Great Acceleration. She has seen the horse-drawn carriage replaced by the electric car, the telegraph replaced by the neural link, and the physical letter replaced by the instant data burst. Yet, she remains stubbornly physical. In a world of holograms and virtual realities, the Eiffel Tower is a reminder of the weight of the world, the cold, hard reality of 7,000 tons of iron that can be touched, climbed, and feared. The darkness of the present day is a realization that we are more fragile than the iron we create. The tower has watched generations of humans be born, dream, fight, and die, while she remains unmoved, a hollow ghost standing watch over a city that is constantly reinventing itself. As the sun sets on the Paris of 2026, the shadow of the Eiffel Tower cuts through the twilight like a jagged blade. It is a shadow that has covered the bodies of soldiers, the schemes of criminals, and the dreams of inventors. The darkest story of the Eiffel Tower is a cycle that never truly ends. It is a story of human ambition pushed to the absolute limit. She was built to show what we could achieve, but she has ended up showing us what we can endure. As the lights flicker on for another night, shimmering against the dark velvet of the French sky, the Iron Lady remains the ultimate witness to the human condition, a cold, silent, and immortal witness to our triumphs, our tragedies, and our terrifyingly beautiful obsession with reaching the stars.